Operation Petticoat was not just Blake Edwards' most improbable breakthrough. It was a $3 million submarine comedy that made Cary Grant the highest-paid actor in Hollywood history. While simultaneously becoming the film during whose production, Grant decided to tell every journalist in America that he was taking weekly doses of LSD, triggering a lawsuit, a cover-up, and a chain of events so consequential that it helped inspire Timothy Leary to begin his own psychedelic experiments. We are digging into the wreckage of Operation Petticoat with 12 secrets the studio tried to bury, secrets locked inside production records, memoir depositions, and the kind of out-of-print industry filings that only surface when you know whose filing cabinets to search. What the Universal Marketing Division received when they approved the title Operation Petticoat was a double entendre positioned just safely enough below the production code's radar to pass. A petticoat was women's underwear. An operation was military action. The collision of those two words in a single title announced, with a precision that the code's censors apparently decided to interpret as innocent wordplay, that the film was going to spend 2 hours extracting comedy from the presence of women's bodies in a space designed to contain only men. What the title also did, and what nobody at Universal discussed publicly, was announce the film's actual structural gambit before a single frame was shown. The military operation in this story would be governed by the logic of the petticoat, not the logic of the war. The women would not disrupt the mission. The mission would be reorganized around the women. That is not the premise of a politely risque submarine comedy. That is a quietly feminist argument about whose priorities a functioning institution ought to serve, and it sailed through the production code under a title that sounded like a wink. The origin story of Operation Petticoat is one of the more structurally perfect pieces of biographical symmetry in Hollywood history, and it belongs entirely to Tony Curtis. In 1943, 16-year-old Bernie Schwartz, not yet Tony Curtis, not yet anyone, sat in a cinema in New York and watched Cary Grant stare into a periscope in Destination Tokyo. That image was sufficient. Curtis enlisted in the United States Navy, specifically requesting assignment to the submarine service, because his hero had appeared in a submarine film. He was assigned instead to the submarine tender USS Proteus, served in the Pacific, and on September 2, 1945, watched the Japanese surrender in Tokyo Bay from his ship's signal bridge. When he became a star and found himself with the institutional leverage to propose projects, he used that leverage precisely. He suggested a film in which Grant would stare into a periscope as he had in Destination Tokyo. The result was Operation Petticoat. The boy who had joined the Navy because of Cary Grant's performance in a submarine film subsequently built the submarine film in which he worked alongside Cary Grant. The circle is so complete it looks engineered. It was not. It was just Tony Curtis wanting, with uncomplicated directness, the thing he had always wanted. Blake Edwards arrived at Operation Petticoat in 1959 as the creator of Peter Gunn, the Emmy-nominated NBC detective series that had established his television reputation and effectively positioned him as a small-screen talent who had not yet demonstrated whether he could translate that intelligence to the big screen at commercial scale. Operation Petticoat was his first big-budget studio film, and the pressure was precise. If he delivered a modest, grossing, competent comedy, he would be a television director who occasionally made films. If he delivered a genuine hit, he would be a film director who had started in television. The distinction mattered enormously in the industry hierarchy of 1959. What Edwards delivered was not a modest, competent comedy. It was the highest-grossing comedy in Universal's 50-year history to that point, a film that transformed his career trajectory so completely that Breakfast at Tiffany's, Days of Wine and Roses, and the entire Pink Panther franchise all became available to him because of what he demonstrated on a submarine set in Key West. The director who needed to prove he was not television became, on the back of Operation Petticoat, one of the defining film comedy craftsmen of the subsequent 2 decades. That transformation was built on a film whose studio considered it a modestly budgeted programmer when they greenlit it. The role of Commander Matt Sherman went through 3 actors before Cary Grant touched it, and the path by which it reached him is a sequence of refusals that each, independently, would have produced a worse film. Universal's first choice was Jeff Chandler, a contract star whose physical authority and dramatic weight would have anchored Sherman in exactly the register the studio wanted, a conventional war film hero in an unconventional situation. Chandler pulled out to film The Jayhawkers. The studio then approached Bob Hope, whose presence would have converted the entire enterprise into a vehicle for Hope's specific brand of cowardly lecher comedy. a register entirely incompatible with the film's actual structural intelligence. Hope declined. He would subsequently describe this decision as one of the greatest career regrets of his life. Universal then came to Grant, who was initially reluctant on the grounds that at 55 he was too old to play a wartime naval commander. What each of those rejections had inadvertently guaranteed was the only performance that could have made Operation Petticoat work at the level it actually operates, the performance of a man so completely at ease with authority that he can afford to find it quietly absurd. Chandler would have played the authority, Hope would have been terrified of it. Grant simply was it, and found it mildly inconvenient, and that distinction is the entire comic register of the film. What Cary Grant extracted from Universal as the condition of his participation in Operation Petticoat was a deal structure so unprecedented that it effectively rewrote the terms under which major stars engaged with studios for the subsequent decade. Through his independent production company Grant, Grant negotiated sole co-ownership of the film, a fee against 75% of net profits or 10% of gross receipts above a threshold, whichever proved greater. He would take ownership of the film outright after 6 to 8 years. The numbers these terms produced were equally unprecedented. Grant ultimately earned $3 million from Operation Petticoat, making him the highest paid actor for a single film in Hollywood history up to that point. That figure was not generated by a salary. It was generated by ownership, by a man who had understood earlier than almost anyone else in the talent pool that the studio system's power rested entirely on maintaining the fiction that stars were employees rather than partners. Grant had formally broken that fiction with a contract, and his earnings from a submarine comedy became the proof of concept that restructured how every major star subsequently negotiated their deals. The film that looked like a light entertainment was, in its production architecture, a document of the studio system's dissolution. The USS Sea Dragon, a real American submarine that had been stationed at Cavite Navy Yard in the Philippines in December 1941, did not sail through the Pacific in a pink submarine as a deliberate act of military eccentricity. What happened was considerably more mundane and considerably more interesting. When the nearby USS Celian was sunk by Japanese bombing, the fire from that wreck scorched the black topcoat off the adjacent Sea Dragon's hull, leaving only the red lead primer undercoat exposed. The Sea Dragon subsequently went on active patrol in that condition, red-hulled, unmistakable, broadcasting her presence to every vessel in the theater because there was no available paint and no available time. Tokyo Rose ridiculed American red pirate submarines in her broadcasts. The screenwriters who researched this incident for Operation Petticoat were specific and faithful to the historical record in every particular except the color. They changed red to pink because pink was funnier. The real submarine that inspired the film's central visual gag was not pink. She was red. She was red because her crew had been bombed. The comedy was built on top of an act of war, and the war's actual color was never quite as amusing as the one the studio needed. In April 1959, while Operation Petticoat was in post-production and Universal's publicity department had arranged a routine press junket at the Key West filming locations, Cary Grant sat down with New York Herald Tribune columnist Joe Hyams and told him, on the record, on tape, that he had been reborn. Grant had been undergoing weekly LSD psychotherapy sessions at the Psychiatric Institute of Beverly Hills with Dr. Mortimer Hartman since the beginning of the year. Legal, supervised, pharmaceutical-grade LSD administered in a controlled clinical setting, and his enthusiasm for the treatment had become, by his own account, impossible to contain. He described crying through sessions while Rachmaninoff played on the phonograph. He described meeting his subconscious. He described having hurt every woman he had ever loved and finally understanding why. Hyams had come to talk about a submarine film. He left with the most significant celebrity confession of 1959. Universal's lawyers, when they discovered what had been said, immediately grasped the problem. Grant had sold exclusive rights to his LSD experiences to Look magazine, and the Hyams interview had breached that contract. Grant then called Hyams and asked him not to publish. Hyams declined. Grant threatened to deny everything. Hyams published. Grant denied everything. Hyams produced the tapes. Grant sued Hyams for $500,000. Hyams countersued, making history as the first columnist ever to sue a major film star. The suit was settled out of court. Grant agreed to cooperate with Hyams on an authorized autobiography in exchange for the lawsuit's dismissal. The journalist settled by buying Grant a $22,000 Rolls-Royce with his share of the autobiography proceeds. That is not a figure of speech. The Key West LSD interview generated, through its legal aftermath, a Rolls-Royce. The submarine film publicity tour that produced all of this was supposed to be about a pink submarine and some nurses. In the months immediately before Operation Petticoat began filming, Tony Curtis was on the set of Billy Wilder's Some Like It Hot, developing his character, Junior, the faux millionaire Shell Oil heir whose seduction technique consists entirely of an impersonation of Cary Grant. Curtis had proposed the idea to Wilder directly. He told him he did a Cary Grant impression and offered it as Junior's affectation. Wilder liked it, and they shot it that way. When the film was screened for Grant, he watched himself being parodied by an actor he had never yet met, then delivered his reaction in the Grant voice Curtis had just performed. "I don't talk like that." The joke was that he said it exactly like that. Within months, Curtis was on the Operation Petticoat set in Key West, working alongside the man he had just impersonated, the idol he had joined the Navy to emulate, the star he had satirized in the film that had just made his reputation, now standing next to him on an actual submarine. Curtis described the experience as the confirmation that he had, at last, genuinely arrived. Grant apparently never raised the impersonation directly. The relationship they built on set, Grant inviting Curtis to his house for breakfast regularly, offering career advice, treating him as something between a protege and an equal, was one of the more unexpectedly warm collaborations in the history of a film whose studio had expected neither warmth nor chemistry. Both had been guaranteed by the simple fact that one man had spent his entire life wanting to stand exactly where he was standing. Operation Petticoat belongs to a lineage of military service comedies that Blake Edwards never publicly acknowledged, and the most direct ancestor it was quietly superseding was John Ford's Mr. Roberts from 1955, the definitive post-war military comedy based on the enormously successful stage play, reverent to its theatrical origins, and built around a drama of authority, conscience, and institutional constraint that was unmistakably serious underneath its comic surface. Edwards absorbed this tradition and then did something Mr. Roberts had never quite managed. He removed the drama's seriousness entirely without removing its intelligence. Where Ford's film needed the audience to understand that Henry Fonda's Roberts was a man of genuine moral weight, Edwards's film needed the audience to understand only that Grant's Sherman was a man of genuine competence, and that competence, under sufficient pressure from the irrational, is inherently funny. The shift from moral seriousness to professional competence as the comedy's foundation is a structural departure of considerable sophistication, and it opened the territory that Edwards would spend the next decade exploiting with the Pink Panther and everything that followed. The submarine set in Key West was, in retrospect, the laboratory where Edwards discovered his true genre, not the service comedy, but the comedy of institutional competence under absurdist assault. Of the three actual World War II-era submarines the Navy provided to portray the USS Sea Tiger, one had a biographical detail so precise it functions as structural irony. The USS Archer Fish, which served as the primary vessel for all of the film's wartime sequences, painted in regulation gray and black for the scenes where the Sea Tiger is still functioning as intended, was present in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, when Japan signed its formal surrender. Tony Curtis was also present. On different ships, in different capacities, the actor and the submarine had both witnessed the same moment that ended the war the film was pretending to depict. Neither fact appeared in any of the film's publicity materials. The Navy did not advertise it. Universal did not mention it. Curtis, who knew perfectly well that he had been in Tokyo Bay for the surrender, appears to have found the coincidence unremarkable, or at least chose not to remark upon it publicly. The submarine that had watched the war end was repainted pink and used to film a comedy about the war's beginning, and the actor who had watched Japan surrender was playing a character trying to escape the Japanese in the same vessel. The symmetry was complete and invisible, and the film ran for 2 hours on top of it without acknowledgement. The critical reception of Operation Petticoat in December 1959 was generous, professionally appreciative, and almost perfectly miscalibrated. Variety's assessment, that the film had no more weight than a sack full of feathers but a lot of laughs, was the consensus crystallized into a single sentence: a light entertainment, technically accomplished, commercially effective, intellectually negligible. Bosley Crowther in the New York Times found the central premise strained and observed that at least 60% of the film's comedy derived from variations on the single joke of women's bodies in close proximity to men's bodies. But bodies, what neither review located, what the critical conversation of 1959 was not equipped to locate, was the structural argument underneath the comedy's surface. The nurses in Operation Petticoat are not disruptive presences who complicate an otherwise functional military operation. They are the film's moral center. Every time Sherman's submarine is forced to reorganize its priorities around human need rather than military protocol, the film is arguing, entirely seriously, that human need is the correct priority. The comedy that Variety found weightless was, under examination, a sustained argument that institutions exist to serve people and not the reverse. The critics reviewed the feathers. The argument was in the sack. In the context of everything that has since been documented about what late 1950s American institutional culture was actually asking of the people inside it, the conformity, the suppression of personal identity in service of professional function, the systematic subordination of human need to procedural correctness. Operation Petticoat reads today as a more precise cultural document than its moment could recognize. Sherman's submarine is an institution that keeps breaking down and keeps being repaired through improvisation, scavenging, and the application of whatever materials happen to be available, including, eventually, women's underwear as gasket material. The institution that refuses the available material because it does not match protocol is the institution that sinks. The institution that uses whatever works is the institution that survives. That argument, embedded in a pink submarine comedy, was the most accurate description of how functioning organizations actually operate that Hollywood produced in 1959. The critics who found it weightless were measuring it against the wrong scale, measured against the next 60 years of organizational theory, management science, and the documented history of institutional failure. It turns out to have been the most practically useful film of its year. The film that survived is lighter than its argument. It is also, in its lightness, more durable than the serious film its argument deserved. Blake Edwards spent his career fighting studio expectations about what comedy was permitted to say, and Operation Petticoat is the production where he first demonstrated that the comedy of institutional competence under pressure could carry genuine moral weight without announcing that it was doing so. Grant made $3 million and became the highest-paid actor in Hollywood history. Curtis fulfilled the ambition he had carried since he was 16 years old in a cinema in New York. Edwards became a film director rather than a television director. The USS Archerfish, which had seen the war end, was painted pink and filmed a comedy about the war beginning. And Cary Grant, in the middle of a submarine film publicity tour, told a journalist everything about his LSD therapy, triggering a lawsuit, a Rolls-Royce, an autobiography, and a chain of influence that helped set Timothy Leary on the path that would redefine American counterculture within a decade. But here is the question that Operation Petticoat leaves embedded in its torpedo tubes, in that improvised gasket made from a nurse's undergarment that keeps the water out long enough to reach port. If the most functionally intelligent organizational argument of 1959, that institutions must prioritize human need over procedural correctness, that improvisation with available materials is more valuable than protocol-compliant failure, was delivered by a pink submarine comedy that the studio greenlit as a light entertainment and the critics dismissed as weightless, then what does that tell you about where serious arguments have always been permitted to live in American popular culture? And if the answer is that the most important ideas have always had to arrive disguised as entertainment to avoid being dismissed as philosophy, which films playing right now are doing the same thing, and which ones are you watching as feathers when you should be feeling the weight? Leave that in the comments. If this investigation changed how you see Operation Petticoat, leave a like, because there are 1,000 films with buried secrets that deserve the same forensic attention, and the algorithm needs to know this kind of digging matters.